Hello, my friends. This is Deepak, as usual, and we are continuing our conversations with luminaries, influencers, people on the cutting edge of science, philosophy, spirituality, social studies, politics, and much, much more. So it's my very great honor and privilege to welcome a very good friend of mine, and you're going to be enlightened about many things today. Jonathan Granoff is not only a luminary, he's an accomplished attorney, has led the movement against the proliferation of nuclear weapons for the last almost more than 4 decades. He is a prominent figure in the United Nations, and also has been very involved in supporting Nobel Peace Laureates. And today is our opportunity to mine his expertise in many areas, particularly conflict resolution, peace, the future of planetary well-being when it comes to the elimination of not only nuclear weapons, but everything else that's connected with violence. And as I said, Jonathan has been very prominent in supporting Nobel Peace Laureates, and has, I think, himself been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as well. Jonathan, before we start, first of all, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for joining me, and thank you for joining with everyone in the audience.
Yes,
that's the real gratitude.
We're going to reach about 15 million by the time we're done with this in the next few weeks. But before I ask you any questions, I have one thing that has been in my mind for a long time. Do all these Nobel laureates that you know, the Peace Nobel laureates, are they at peace with themselves? Do they have peace of mind? Or are they just nice, angry peace activists?
Well, first, my relationship is there's a summit of Nobel Peace Laureates that takes place every year. It's been in abeyance because of the COVID that Mikhail Gorbachev initiated. And I represent the summit of the Nobel Peace Laureates at the UN. And I have the privilege of being the senior advisor to the group and being involved in writing their collective statements. So several years ago, we were going to have the summit in South Africa to honor Nelson Mandela. But the Chinese zilched it. They put pressure on the South African government to prevent the Nobel laureates from coming there. So they moved it to Rome. And I was one of the drafters of the collective statement. And I circulated a draft. And the beginning of the draft said, "Nothing is as much an impediment to peace as the mind of man without loving kindness and compassion. Nothing is as noble as an individual who overcomes the adversities of the world and accomplishes peace. For that reason, amongst other reasons, we come together to honor Nelson Mandela." So some of the women Nobel laureates from Scandinavia went crazy with the language, the mind of man. They said, "How could you be so inconsiderate? It's the mind of men and women." So of course I changed it to, "Nothing could be such an impediment to peace as the human mind bereft of loving kindness and compassion." And then the leader of Pugwash, which won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for its work of bringing scientists from Russia and the Soviet Union together with scientists of the West to stop the threat of annihilating humanity. Their president called me and said, "Gee, we can't sign that, Jonathan, because it's too spiritual." And I said, "Take it up with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu and leave me alone." So that language was in there because they had thought about this very point. And I can say that one of the things that I've actually seen over the years is the impact of laureates such as the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu on others who had done a great deal to bring peace in the world, overcoming communism, Lech Walesa, overcoming apartheid, Willem de Klerk, overcoming the oppression of the people of East Timor, José Ramos Horta. And I saw how, or Jody Williams working to eliminate landmines, and others like myself working, international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war, to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I saw the impact of some of the laureates who were very spiritually grounded, making exactly your point, that if we are trying to bring about peace externally in the world without having peace within ourselves, we're never going to achieve it. And one of the things that I've been really fascinated by, Deepak, is that the same principles that bring peace internally are exactly the same principles that bring peace amongst nations. Because the human community has to have a moral fabric, just like as individuals. For us to have inner peace, we have to have a moral fabric.
Yeah, it only makes sense that peace can only be created by those who are peaceful, just like love can only be expressed by those who have been the givers and the recipients of love. And that's not a new principle. Mahatma Gandhi said, you have to be the change you wish to see in the world. And as you know, you being a great teacher and student of Sufism and you know, somebody who's very familiar with Rumi and Hafiz and all the great wisdom traditions, not only of the East, but of the Middle East as well, that unless we have that peace consciousness, no amount of activism or dogma or ideological frameworks for conflict resolution are going to make any difference. And I think that's part of the problem in institutions. Institutions go by rules, regulations, dogma, policies, funding, jealousy, competition, even amongst, I've witnessed a lot of competition amongst the Nobel Peace Laureates and a lot of influence peddling and power mongering. And I think part of the reason we haven't succeeded is we think that creating peace is something independent of our own peaceful nature, which is beyond the conditioned mind. So as I study, I mean, I'm a student of yoga. Yoga starts with the yamas and the niyamas. And the yamas are rules, or they're frequently called restraints, but relationship with the self. And the niyamas are relationships or observances that help you connect to other people and to the social fabric or to life at large. And the first yama is, and I'm not going to go into all of them, obviously, I'm here to speak to you and understand from you your work. But the first yama is Ahimsa, which, has been translated as nonviolence, which is fine, but it's peace presence and peace consciousness. And the great teacher, yogi Patanjali, the author of all the literature on, original literature on yoga, he says, in the presence of Ahimsa, in the presence of peace consciousness, all beings cease to feel hostility. All beings, not even just humans, all beings cease to feel hostility, not by what you say, not by what you do, not by how you act, not by writing down agendas and declarations, but just your presence. And that's Ahimsa, the presence of those who are at peace. Everybody feels peaceful, just their presence, which again, you being a Sufi, understand the notion of darshan, which means presence, actually. Darshan is presence of pure consciousness, which is also pure love. So that's the first yama, and then there are others but then you go to the niyamas, which are observances. I forget, no need to enumerate them, but the final one, I'm talking about the first one and the last one. The last one is called Ishwar Pranidhana, which means surrender to the divine mystery. And everything else is in between. I mean, if I have presence of peace and I have surrendered to the divine mystery, that would be the solution for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. Instead of all this rah, rah, rah all the time that we're engaged in, creating so much noise about peace that even the noise overshadows the presence of peace. So I just wanted to share that with you as where I'm coming from, and I think where you're coming from. But given that we need institutions, today's social fabric, we can't do anything. Tell me a little bit about your efforts for the abolition of nuclear weapons or the containment of it. Why do we still have nuclear weapons? How is it possible that humanity can tolerate mechanisms of death which are so violent, which are so cruel, which are so inhumane, that just the fact that we have this still after the atomic bomb that America delivered to the world. And, I was reading the other day the remnants, the memories of one of the pilots who dropped the atomic bomb. I think either recently passed away or he's in his 90s or whatever. They asked him, I forget his name, what's your memory the day you dropped the bomb? He says, we came to Hawaii and we had pancakes with maple syrup and omelets and sausages or whatever. That's his memory. On the day, 500,000 people were incinerated in less than a few minutes, and the aftermath of that is still there in terms of cancer, etc. Something is very drastically wrong with our humanity that we have to go on a 40-year campaign to not abolish nuclear weapons, just to contain them. And in the meanwhile, India starts producing them, and Pakistan, and now Iran, and we kind of mind that while, the original perpetrators of this abominable act against humanity is the United States itself.
It's not just the United States. It's there's 8 other nations with these abominable weapons. You asked the reason for it. The reason for it is that although the nations of the world have agreed unanimously in the United Nations system to pursue the sustainable development goals, to protect the climate, to eliminate poverty, to have gender equity, and many other virtuous necessary steps for security. In the corridors of power of these states, there's a myth that still dominates. And the myth comes from Roman times, which is prepare for peace, receive war, prepare for war, receive peace. They believe that the assertion of the fullness of military force and power brings peace. So much so that the strategic command people have in recent times expressed the aspiration for what they call full spectrum dominance, completely contrary to the pursuit of strategic stability or the promotion of global democracy. Dominance meaning domination of the planet. So the United States now has over 740 military bases around the world. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. We have, through NATO as well, an expanded our containment of Russia and moved our nuclear weapons into Europe. It is based on the premise that these weapons bring security. And oddly enough, the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, the Russia, the United States, China, France, and the United Kingdom, recently issued a statement saying that the purpose of the nuclear arsenals is defensive, and yet they refuse to pledge that they will not use them first. First use of nuclear weapons is obviously not defensive. We now know that the science recently has discovered that should less than 1% of the less than 14,000 nuclear weapons in the world were to be used, it would throw at least 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere and end civilization, not just for the adversary against whom you use the weapons, but your own country. So we've moved from mutually assured destruction to self-assured destruction. So the irrationality of it has to be explained as, I believe, the way Governor Jerry Brown explained it, and Gregory Mattson, the great psychologist, described it, as totemic, as psychological, as almost like a worship of an idol. And it's based on this premise that security is obtained by the assertion of power. So in the current military budget of the United States, even with Joe Biden, he has reaffirmed, and I think people should step back and realize the extent of this, $1.7 trillion allocations to modernize the arsenal. That's an enormous amount of money. That's an enormous pledge of money. And it allows for the institutionalization of adversity amongst these major countries of the world. So it's not just the ongoing threat of human annihilation, but it's the affirmation that we should not see the human family, as the Upanishads say, as one. The reality is the human family is one. And the present day, the myth of the pursuit of security through these weapons has reached burlesque proportions such that the more we perfect the weapons, the less security we obtain. And it's because of the paradigm of how security is perceived. So there's another model that the UN has proposed through several General Assembly resolutions that I think is much more realistic. It's called human security. And I think it goes sort of to the deeper spiritual grounding, which is to love people and use things. So the Nuclear Posture Review of the United States says we have to make sure that the arsenal is safe and secure. There are some really brilliant people suggesting that our policy should be to make the people safe and secure. You have to grasp how distorted the doctrine is. We'll make the weapons safe and secure, but not focusing on the people. So a human security model would say the first duty of all states is to make its people secure. And you cannot bring security to the citizens of any state in the world today without beginning with the premise that the human family is one. Because the actual threats that we're faced with, that we have to address, cannot be addressed at a national level. They threaten all humanity. Pandemics do not carry passports. The climate does not recognize national borders. The very breath of life that we share, the prana, as you would call it, the breath of life is interdependent with the health of the oceans. 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from the phytoplankton, which depends on the pH of the oceans, which depends on the climate of the planet. The next part of our external lung, our third lung, are the rainforests, and they're being cut down faster than they can regenerate. The web of life, the biodiversity, the mystery of the great gift of life is being shredded at 1,000 times the evolutionary base rate. And we don't know at what point there's a tipping point where our species depends on other species. If the human species ended, ants would be fine. But if ants disappeared, we have about 3 months because they are essential to our well-being. So we don't know at what point we're putting at risk our own life. But there's a moral issue to me, which is first the truth that the human family is one. that all of us are equal, that all of us have rights, that all of us have a right to security. And the purpose of the state, the creation of the state, is to bring security to its people. And it can't be done at a national level anymore. And it certainly can't be done by institutionalizing the adversity of the threat of global annihilation. We need to have a human security paradigm of security that begins with the premise that because of technology and modernity, our need to cooperate far exceeds any need for the adversity. You know, and the Cold War ended when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan met in 1985 in Geneva at a summit. And at that summit, they agreed on two principles. One principle was a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. Now, that is recognized, but the second principle in the same paragraph of their collective statement was neither nation shall seek military superiority over the other. And they then started moving toward cooperation, and that's what ended the Cold War. We're now in a cycle of reverting back to that adversity of the Cold War, and it's very dangerous. And that's why I'm working with the World Academy of Arts and Science and the United Nations now to promote a human security model that focuses on the global threats that threaten everyone on the planet, that require us to cooperate, that require us to work together, because we need another approach, another countervailing set of principles and arguments to balance out the excessive militarism. We're not saying that we do away with militaries. We're saying that it's gotten to the point that it's excessive. The US military budget hovers around $770 billion. It was increased by 5% this year by the Biden administration. It was increased over Trump's ridiculous budget. The military budget of Russia is less than 60 billion. The military budget of China is less than 260 billion. So we're spending, the United States is just profligate in this. And I believe that if we applied the golden rule to our international policy, as by the way, Robert McNamara came to the conclusion about this in his end days, that this was the mistake of Vietnam, that this was the mistake of the Cold War. The same principle of the golden rule, that we have to treat others as we want to be treated, which is universal ethical norm in our personal lives. If we looked at, say, the current tension we're seeing in the world today, imagine if Russia wanted to deploy nuclear weapons in Canada and Mexico. Just think of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What would the United States think? This would be unacceptable to us. Is it so odd that the Russians are concerned that we've expanded NATO by over 15 nations since the end of the Cold War, right up to their borders, and put nuclear weapons surrounding them? Nuclear weapons deployed in Turkey, nuclear weapons deployed in Germany, the Netherlands, that these are our nuclear weapons right in their region, and that we're talking about expanding NATO to the Ukraine and Georgia? Is it odd that they would be disturbed by that? Of course not. But and yet we're now mutually demonizing each other. I think your point, Deepak, that understanding the importance of coming back to our core humanity, what makes us human, the qualities of peace, compassion, the qualities of tolerance, the qualities that bring us together as human beings, turn out to be the same qualities that bring us together with our core self. That anger, falsehood, jealousy, pride, miserliness, greed, fear, not only separate us from one another, but they separate us from our very soul, because the nature of the soul is luminosity, not shrouded in darkness, but shrouded in love, shrouded in compassion. And when we apply those principles, like we did in the Marshall Plan, rather than what we did after World War I, crushing the Germans and reaping the reward of Nazism, World War II, wisdom, the United Nations system, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, helping our adversaries progress brought us peace and security, just like treating others in your family, treating others in your neighborhood, and working on eliminating those qualities that separate us brings inner peace. Exactly the same principle.
Jonathan, if we look at history, and we can go back as far as we want to the times of the biblical prophets, or we can go back in Asia to medieval times, or we go back to the Dark Ages, so-called, and go back to the 10th century. I can't find any evidence anywhere in history where humans have not been violent, where humans haven't killed other humans for money or for power or for whatever. Now we have a situation where we have the same medieval, dark age, tribal, separate, fearful minds, but we have modern capacities, like nuclear weapons, one of them. But we have many. We have cyber warfare, we have biological warfare. And if anything, over the last 500 years since the scientific revolution, because of the advancement of science and mechanized ways to kill each other, also mechanized food production and mechanized everything, pharmaceuticals and so on. Right now, what we are facing is a world which has this threat of extinction from nuclear weapons, but also from climate change, also from new pandemics that are a result of climate change, also from poison in our food chain, manufactured, processed, factory-produced farming introduces chemicals that are worse than Agent Orange. Every time you put a piece of steak in your body that comes from a factory, you're also ingesting something similar to Agent Orange, which was used in the killing fields of Vietnam and more. And so when you look at that, when you look at social injustice across the world, we have 100 people in the United States controlling 99% of the wealth in the United States. You have power mongers across the world. Every national leader that I can think of, perhaps with the exception of, say, Angela Merkel or the Prime Minister of Ireland or New Zealand, I can't think of a national leader who's not a thug or who's couldn't be called a criminal. The world is being run by gangsters, thugs, criminals who are called national leaders, some of them legitimately elected because they're elected by people who are also power mongers or ethnocentric or racist or bigoted or full of fear or so-called white supremacist or whatever. But looking across this landscape that we have, that we call planet Earth, somewhere in the junkyard of infinity, you have extreme social injustice, extreme economic injustice, racism, bigotry, gender injustice, mechanized death, poison in the food chain, climate change, mass migrations, pandemics. The biomass of this planet comes mostly from livestock and humans. Other species are extinct. We know that evolution favors life when there's maximum diversity of life. So given that, and given that you've spent 40 years working in this area, I would say that at this moment, humanity is sleepwalking its way to extinction, and that what we call normal is the insanity right now and the psychopathology of the average, and that if we don't admit that, number one, we are sleepwalking to extinction, then we are in denial. Number two, that our collective behavior is insane, then we're declaring our own insanity. And that's fine. You just said if ants disappeared, life would go extinct on this planet. If humans disappeared, I think life would flourish on this planet. So given this hard work, given the billions and trillions of dollars that have been spent, given the constant bickering and power mongering and influence peddling and cronyism and corruption that is existing out there, I would say to have hope in this situation, given that we're just recycling old constructs with modern capacities, I think that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as hope. Either hope is a sign of despair right now, and they go together. I think unless we come up with a creative solution, we don't need hope, we don't need despair, we need creativity. And that creativity is maximized when we fall in love with life. But I don't see that happening. Now I have long ago dissociated myself from these institutions because I don't want to hang out with thugs and villains and power mongers and gangsters who kind of live in palaces and congressional halls and government institutions. I think unless there's a global, distributed, non-institutional, non-governmental, non-military, non-industrial special interests, whether it's industrial military, industrial agriculture, given what is out there, it is foolish and insane in my mind to even work with these institutions. I mean, I love the United Nations, but there's a lot of corruption in the United Nations. You and I know that. There are a lot of peacemakers who've been very violent in places like Africa. A lot of UN so-called peacemakers have actually been guilty of violence and rape and pillage. Isn't it time to either wake up and say, guys, it's not working? We need a global solution with people who are at peace with themselves, people who love humanity and are in love with themselves, people who are not interested in power mongering in the name of ego. Unless we create a global movement that reaches a critical mass of higher consciousness, I think we're screwed. And if we don't address that, then we're just kind of recycling the whole thing over and over again. First World War, Second World War, United Nations, Korea, Vietnam, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, Egypt, Libya, what now this Kazakhstan. It is totally insane. And if we don't agree on that, then just go to the bar and get drunk.
Well, I certainly agree with you that the externalization of pride and arrogance by individual leaders is an expression of Thanatos, the death wish. That our economic system is also based on another myth, which is that we can have our major economic driving institutions based purely on the market and have their accounting principles deal with the natural world as an externality and ignore it and report on what they do to the market, but not what they do to the climate, not what they do to our rivers, not what they do to our bodies. So we have an economic model based on infinite growth in a finite system. It's based on the myth of infinite growth. It's based on the myth that the things that we create should be the only point of reference rather than having an economic system in harmony with the natural world. But I beg to differ with you about such a dismal view of human history and human capacity. Ashok, for example, in your heritage from India, brought an end to slaughter and brought Ahimsa into practice and was instrumental in the flourishing of the Indus Valley civilization. The great sages and rishis of the region, all of them, without exception, said that the character of our humanity doesn't come from the earth, air, fire, water. It doesn't come from the world. It comes from the intrinsic luminosity of the soul, of what we're born with within, that our wisdom comes from within. An example of that teaching is found in the West with Socrates, who said that education is to draw out the intrinsic wisdom of the soul. Now, I would say personally, with this very dismal view that you pointed out, it is really grounded on the Buddhist first truth, the first noble truth, which is there is a fallen world, there is suffering. And the best you can get out of this is old age, sickness, and death. No one wins if that's your metrics. But the Buddha continues, and the path of liberation is the path of compassion, the path of finding compassion, of feeling the suffering of others as one's own, and then bringing skillful means into action to address it. But if we use the metric, and he never said use the metrics of the world as to whether those skillful means would be successful. And I come back to Socrates. Socrates is condemned by 500 jurors for questioning the mythology of his society. That's what he's condemned for. And on the eve when he's to drink the hemlock, his disciples come and say, we've made your escape ready. And he says, no, because this would be denying the rule of law necessary for the people of Athens. Although the rule of law is imperfect and it's been misapplied to me, I am not at all afraid of dying. I know where my soul is going. I have seen, as Martin Luther King, I've been on the top of the mountain. I've seen it. I'm not afraid. And I'm not really leaving, just my body is gone. And he drinks the hemlock. And he drinks the hemlock in order that you and I can live in a society where we can have this discussion, where we have certain protections by the law, that we don't live completely under the tyranny of the women fancy of tyrants who would kill us for questioning their current abuse of authority. So I think that for personal peace, bringing compassion into action is essential for personal peace, to feel the suffering of others as one's own and addressing it. Ironically, that process, which is really love in action, is what brings inner peace. Without it, if you have the sentiment of love and don't bring it into action, it will wither. And if you try to act without love in your heart, it'll be catastrophic. So the two have to come together. And if you look at the great social transformers in history, and you look at the metrics of the world, look at Jesus. By the time the cock crows, all of his disciples abandon him. And yet he's an example of a towering success, as is Socrates. So just because the laws of international affairs are often violated, the fact is we have, even China, which has a system I don't agree with, but they've taken 400 to 500 million people out of abject poverty with caring for their collective people. The fact that there is murder doesn't mean that we throw away the law that prohibits murder. The fact that countries are not operating right now in a way that is sustainable, we shouldn't throw away the nation. We shouldn't throw away our political institutions. What we have to do is bring them to reality, bring them to a sense of reality. Science tells us, as you pointed out, rationally, we cannot keep destroying the regenerative processes of nature and think we can survive. Nor can we violate the golden rule in the affairs amongst nations and survive. I come back to the power of ethical principles to guide us. And just Deepak, let me just finish one point about making it clear to everybody what that means. Imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention, which Richard Nixon brought into effect, oddly enough, said no country can use smallpox or polio as a weapon, but we'll let 9 countries use the plague as a weapon to bring international security. We would say that's absurd. It's inequitable. It's immoral. It's crazy. But that's precisely the regime we have with nuclear weapons. So I think that because of people like yourself bringing some wisdom to the public discourse, calling on people to wake up individually and use their moral agency, that we have the possibility of using these technological innovations that humanity has created. But it will only succeed if we go by the principle, love people, use things. Instead of loving all of our things, including our ideas of race, nation, gender, self, everything temporal, and forgetting what makes the human being sacred and worth saving is our role in the web of life, which is we have the consciousness of light.
So, okay, Jonathan, I heard you. I agree with everything you've said. But I have my own misgivings. I look at Socrates, I look at Plato, and Plato was very interesting because he commented on democracy being the rule of the average and frequently, therefore, a psychopathology of the average. He discounted aristocracy as a control mechanism. He favored a republic with statesmen, philosophers as the leaders. And except during his time, I have never actually seen a country run by statesmen, philosophers. You mentioned Ashoka. Yeah, he had a reign of a few years, less than a few decades. I mentioned luminaries like Nelson Mandela, like Mahatma Gandhi, like Martin Luther King Jr., like His Holiness Dalai Lama, like you mentioned the sages of the Upanishads, and you also, we mentioned Bishop Tutu, who I had the good fortune to meet once, as I did many times His Holiness. But put all of them together, put the luminaries of Greece together, Pythagoras and Aristotle and Plato and Parmenides and Hermes Megistus, the magician before that, put them and put the prophets of the Old Testament, put the sages of the Upanishads, put the Eastern wisdom sages, the Zen masters, all together, and you have a very romantic idea about human civilization. But even during those times when these people, if you put them in the context of trillions of people who have come and gone before us, it's a handful of people. And our romance of history is built on a handful of people that I could name. We just named them. We'd have a difficult time to name any more right now. We just named them. And we romanticize how glorious humans can be based on a handful of people that we can count in 5 minutes, whilst the rest of Greece was engaging in war games, in sacrificing humans to lions, in sexism, in slavery. While the sages of the Upanishads were glorifying our connection to the divine, there was a lot of plunder and rape and murder going on in India at the same time. In fact, that was the majority of the activity.
Yeah.
Romanticize is a danger, I think,
Yes.
because we start going back to our sleepwalking. So now, before I finish, because we don't have too much time, we have, unless we finish in 10 minutes, we can't post this because of social media rules, etc. But before we go any further on this, I want to just say that recently I've been looking at what people call the science of emergence. And they say when you have shared vision, when you have maximum diversity of opinion, but also talent and education, but let's say you have an ecosystem of maximum diversity of not only race, gender, ethnicity, art, religion, science, music, poetry, film, theater, drama, education, maximum diversity, where people complement each other's strengths and they incubate in the stillness of being with love, then emergence happens. And emergence is a new story, new context, new relationships, new creativity. And before I end, I'm asking you, who has worked for 45 years, do you think we should go back to the institutions and depend on gangsters who call themselves leaders in the world? Or should we now, this is a call for humanity, an urgent call for humanity, for emergence and creativity and love in action, as you said, love in action, which is called karma yoga. As you said, love without action is irrelevant. Action without love is meaningless. Love in action can create wonders. Do we not need right now love in action at a grassroots level, a conversation like this one that expands this movement, and to heck with the gangsters? Or are you going to continue with this organizational argument? Everybody's arguing, should we be in Kazakhstan? What should be in Ukraine? You point out the insanity of unilateral decisions that we deserve the best, and no one else can make nuclear weapons. Iran can't make them, and so and so can't make them, but we can. Korea can't make them, we can. And this kind of insanity, I don't think is going to solve the problem. So in less than 5 minutes, can you say what's your call to action to people who are listening? And can we indeed create an ecosystem of emergence that is not dependent on gangsters?
Absolutely. We have to make every effort, both internally and in our actions, to bring the highest human virtues and qualities into action, or our short journey in life is bereft of meaning. Our humanity is at stake. Every child is born into this world responding to love. Every mother looks in the child's eyes and forgets the difficulty of birthing. We're at a moment of birthing a global civilization that will flourish greater than any time in human history, or we are on the verge of destroying the very precious gifts that the Creator has given us. And it turns on whether we will find love within ourselves and bring it into action. I had the privilege of living with a great human being who treated all lives as his own life. So I saw the transformative power. A great teacher named Guru Bawa Muhaiyaddeen, who was found in the jungles of Sri Lanka. And he demonstrated a point you've been making, which is there is a substrata in which we are all part of one unified field of life. We are all part of one unified luminosity of perfection beyond description, that we are gifted with an array of that perfection. Every human being is gifted with that, and thus every human being is precious. But we create institutions. We have moral agency with these institutions, Deepak. And the fact that they're run by imperfect people at this moment, by many thugs, but there are virtuous people in these institutions. We have moral agency with them. To the extent we have them, so you wanted 4 actions. I'll give you 4 actions. First, well, with you and I, let's work on promoting human security and changing the paradigm from military nationalism and destruction of the environment to meeting real human and living needs, because to deal with humans, we have to deal with the web of life. We need to ask every political leader, what are your plans to eliminate poverty? Because we have the ability to eliminate that kind of suffering now. 2, what are your plans to protect the climate? Because that gets into all of the whole relationship to the natural world. And 3, what are your plans to get rid of nuclear weapons? Because that means changing the paradigm of security. But more importantly, every one of us can ask ourselves as fundamental every day, have I found the highest love within myself? And am I bringing it into action? And last but not least, coming to this breath and realizing that this breath, this moment that we share is a gift. This breath is a gift of life that none of us create, that we don't have forever, that is precious beyond measure, and that we are sharing. And coming back to this moment of peace, this moment of gratitude, this moment of humanity.
So, Jonathan, thank you very much for being my guest today. This is an urgent call right now for humanity. If you want to expand this awareness in the world, keep engaging people at the grassroots level. I'm on board and will do my best to reach critical mass of awareness for creative solutions. But in the meanwhile, this is a moment where I think humanity is on a respirator in ICU, and it's not just COVID that's doing it. Humanity right now is intensive care unit on a respirator, and
you're a doctor.
The call to action has to be urgent, correct?
Deepak, you cited Plato, but he had another disciple, Diogenes. And yes, you sound a lot more like Diogenes than Plato, because Diogenes challenged the institutions and challenged people at an individual level, very much the way Socrates did. And so you're actually very much in that tradition of the importance of each of us as individuals becoming sanctuaries of truth and peace and goodness. That even if all the institutions collapse, we still have to come back to that which created us, and what we are is what we bring there. And let us bring peace there.
Start with Ahimsa and then surrender to the divine mystery. Very good. If you want to continue this movement, this could be a global movement as long as we keep the gangsters out. Okay. So, and I don't care whether they're Democrats or Republicans or communists or socialists, whatever. Every communist and socialist I've met has a left-wing philosophy and a right-wing lifestyle, and every right-wing Republican I've met is a cunning hypocrite who tells people that they can help the downtrodden while messing with the democracy at the same time. So I think we have to go beyond this now. We need a critical mass of consciousness for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. Or, as I said, go to the bar and get drunk.